His name was Copper, a Redbone Coonhound worth more to the Dawson family than their house, their land, their trucks combined. 3 generations of breeding, the finest hunting dog in Telfair County, maybe in all of Georgia. When the McKinnon crew took him, they thought they were stealing property. They were stealing a death sentence. 14 men learned what happens when you take the wrong thing from the wrong family. The Georgia Pines kept the secret for 45 years. This is that story. There is a particular kind of bond between a hunting family and their dogs that people who have never lived that life cannot fully understand. It is not sentiment, though sentiment is part of it. It is not utility, though utility is certainly involved. It is something older than either, something that reaches back to the first moment when humans and canines recognized in each other a partnership that could benefit both, a covenant sealed not in words, but in shared work and mutual dependence. In the rural South of 1979, this bond carried weight that the modern world has largely forgotten. A hunting dog was not a pet, not a companion animal kept for emotional comfort, not a creature whose purpose was to provide unconditional love to humans who needed it. A hunting dog was a working partner, an investment of time and resources and expertise that might span decades, a living repository of knowledge that could not be written in books or taught in classrooms. The training of a hunting dog began before birth, in the careful selection of breeding pairs whose qualities complemented each other, whose bloodlines had been refined over generations for the specific demands of the work. It continued through puppyhood, the identification of promising individuals from each litter, the culling of those who lacked the necessary drives or abilities. It extended through months and years of patient instruction, the development of skills that could not be rushed, the building of communication between human and canine that operated below the level of conscious thought. A man might spend 5 years developing a single exceptional dog, might invest thousands of hours and thousands of dollars in the process, might create something that could not be replicated or replaced. The loss of such an animal was not merely financial, though the financial implications were significant. It was the loss of irreplaceable knowledge, of countless hours of shared experience, of a partnership that had been built through patient effort and could not be rebuilt overnight. The Dawson family of Telfair County, Georgia, understood this bond as deeply as any family in the South. They had been hunting these pine woods for 5 generations by 1979, had arrived in the 1840s when this land was still frontier, had carved a place for themselves in territory that rewarded stubbornness and punished weakness. They had survived the Civil War, when Sherman's march had come close enough to send refugees streaming through the county. They had survived Reconstruction, when the old order collapsed and something new and uncertain rose in its place. They had survived the grinding poverty that defined rural Georgia for the century that followed, the pellagra and the hookworm and the endless struggle against land that gave up its wealth reluctantly. Through all of this, they had maintained their dogs. The Dawson hounds were legendary in a region where hunting dogs were taken seriously, where the quality of a man's pack said something about the quality of the man himself. Families in this part of Georgia could recite the bloodlines of famous dogs the way families elsewhere recited the bloodlines of famous horses, could trace pedigrees back generations, could tell stories about individual animals whose feats had become part of local folklore. The Dawsons bred Redbone Coonhounds, a breed developed in the American South specifically for the demands of hunting in this terrain. The Redbone was a scent hound, bred to follow trails that might be hours old, to pursue quarry through swamps and thickets where other dogs would give up, to bay with a voice that could be heard for miles when the prey was finally cornered. They were beautiful animals, their coats a deep red that gave the breed its name, their ears long and drooping, their eyes carrying the particular soulfulness that hound breeds possessed. The Dawson breeding program had begun in the 1920s when Hollis's father Ezekiel had acquired a pair of exceptional Redbones from a breeder in Tennessee. Ezekiel had recognized something in those dogs, a quality that went beyond their physical characteristics, a potential that could be developed through careful selection and patient work. He had begun the process of refinement that his descendants would continue for 60 years, breeding for the specific combination of traits that made a truly exceptional hunting dog. The qualities Ezekiel sought were not simple to define or easy to identify. Nose was paramount, the ability to detect and follow scent that other dogs would miss, to work trails that were old or faint or contaminated by other odors. But nose alone was not enough. A good hunting dog needed stamina, the ability to work for hours in difficult terrain without flagging. It needed voice, the distinctive baying that allowed hunters to follow their dogs through forests where visual contact was impossible. It needed intelligence, the capacity to make decisions in the field without human guidance. It needed temperament, the combination of drive and tractability that made a dog effective and controllable. Breeding for these qualities required patience that modern commerce rarely allowed. A breeder might wait years to see whether a particular mating produced the desired results, might evaluate puppies through multiple seasons before determining which ones carried the qualities worth preserving. A single mistake, breeding from a dog whose flaws weren't apparent until its offspring matured, could set a program back by a decade. Success required knowledge that couldn't be gained from books, instinct that couldn't be taught, commitment that couldn't be sustained by anyone focused on short-term results. The Dawsons had that patience, that knowledge, that commitment. They had maintained their breeding program through the Depression, when money for dog food was scarce and the temptation to sell their best stock was constant. They had maintained it through World War II, when young men who might have continued the work were overseas fighting in Europe and the Pacific. They had maintained it through the social changes of the 1960s and 1970s, when the world around them transformed, but their fundamental purpose remained unchanged. By 1979, the Dawson line produced dogs that were sought after across the Southeast. Buyers came from Alabama and Florida, from Tennessee and the Carolinas, willing to pay prices that would have seemed absurd for just a dog, but that reflected the true value of what generations of Dawsons had created. The breeding program provided a steady income that supplemented the family's timber operations, that helped smooth the financial fluctuations that any agricultural enterprise faced. But the program's value couldn't be measured entirely in money. It was also about identity, about continuity, about the maintenance of tradition in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to tradition. The Dawson hounds were proof that the family's way of life still meant something, that the knowledge they had accumulated over generations still had value, that they were not merely remnants of a disappeared past, but carriers of something worth preserving into the future. And among all the dogs the Dawsons had ever produced, across 60 years of careful breeding and patient development, Copper was the finest. He had been born on March 17, 1974, one of 7 puppies in a litter that his breeders had known from the beginning was exceptional. His sire was a dog named Red Chief, who had won field trials across 3 states, and who had already produced offspring that were proving the quality of his genetics. His dam was a bitch named Belle, whose bloodline traced back to the original Tennessee stock that Ezekiel had acquired 55 years earlier, whose own qualities had made her the foundation female of the current breeding program. The mating that produced Copper had been planned for 2 years before it occurred. The genetics analyzed, the potential outcomes calculated as precisely as such things could be calculated. Hollis and Virgil had studied pedigrees going back 6 generations, had considered every strength and weakness in both lines, had concluded that this pairing represented the best chance to produce something truly exceptional. They had been right. From the first weeks of his life, Copper had shown the qualities that separated great dogs from ordinary ones. His nose was extraordinary, even by the standards of a breed known for scenting ability. He could detect trails that were 24 hours old, when other dogs from the same litter lost them at 12. His voice was clear and carrying, with a distinctive tone that could be identified from a mile away, that carried through the pine forests like a bell through fog. His stamina was remarkable, his ability to work hour after hour without rest, exceeding anything the Dawsons had seen in decades of breeding. But it was his intelligence that truly set him apart. Copper learned faster than any dog the family had ever trained, understood commands after a single repetition, anticipated what his handlers wanted before they gave the signals. He made decisions in the field that showed sophisticated reasoning, adjusting his pursuit strategies based on terrain and conditions, recognizing when prey had doubled back or split up, working out problems that would have stymied dogs with twice his experience. By the age of 2, Copper was already being recognized as something special. By 3, he had won every field trial he'd been entered in, had accumulated trophies and ribbons that filled an entire cabinet in the Dawson house. By 4, he was being discussed in hunting circles across the Southeast as potentially the finest Redbone Coonhound of his generation, perhaps of any generation. By 1979, when he was 5 years old and in the absolute prime of his working life, copper was worth more to the Dawson family than any other asset they possessed. The offers that came in for him, $15,000, $20,000, once an offer of $25,000 from a wealthy hunter in Florida, represented more money than the family typically earned in a year. The stud fees he could command, if the family had been willing to make him generally available for breeding, would have made them wealthy by the standards of Telfair County. They refused every offer. Copper was not for sale. Copper would never be for sale. He was the culmination of 60 years of work, the living proof of what patient dedication could produce, the embodiment of everything the Dawson family had built and everything they hoped to pass to future generations. He was, in a very real sense, family. Not in the sentimental way that modern pet owners use the term, but in the deeper way that working partnerships were family. The way that shared purpose and mutual dependence and years of common effort created bonds that transcended the merely biological. Taking him would be like taking a child. The men who took him didn't understand that. They saw a dog, valuable certainly, but ultimately property, ultimately something that could be acquired through force if other methods failed. They came from a world where everything had a price, where anything could be bought or stolen, where the bonds that connected people to their animals and their land and their history were just sentiment, easily broken, easily replaced. They were catastrophically wrong. The Dawson family would teach them how wrong they were. And the lesson would be written in blood across 14 bodies, over 13 days in October 1979. But that lesson would come later. First, there is the story of the family itself, the world they inhabited, the life they were living before everything changed. Telfair County occupied a position in the geography of Georgia that seemed designed to encourage forgetting. Located in the south-central part of the state, it lay in the region that Georgians called the Wiregrass, a vast expanse of longleaf pine and sandy soil that stretched from the fall line to the coastal plain, encompassing some of the poorest and most sparsely populated territory in the eastern United States. The county was bounded by Dodge County to the north, Montgomery and Wheeler to the east, Jeff Davis to the south, and Wilcox to the west, a collection of names that meant nothing to anyone who didn't live there, that appeared on maps as anonymous shapes with populations too small to matter to state politicians or federal planners. The county seat was McRae, a town of perhaps 3,000 people in 1979, small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, but large enough to support the basic institutions, a courthouse, a hospital, a handful of churches, that any community needed to function. The downtown was a single main street lined with brick buildings from the 1920s, some still occupied by functioning businesses, others showing the vacancy and decay that had become common across rural Georgia as population drained toward Atlanta and the coast. The economy was timber, mostly. The longleaf pine that had once covered millions of acres had been largely exhausted by the early 20th century, cut for lumber and naval stores, until only fragments remained. But the second growth forest that replaced it still provided income for families willing to work the land. Pulpwood went to paper mills in Macon and Savannah. Saw logs went to sawmills that processed them into lumber for construction. The work was hard, the prices unpredictable, the profits marginal, but it was work that could be done by those who owned land, and owning land was still the foundation of independence in communities like this. Agriculture provided supplementary income, though the soil here was poor, sandy and acidic, requiring constant amendment to produce anything of value. The farms that survived in Telfair County were small operations, family enterprises that produced vegetables and livestock for local consumption rather than cash crops for distant markets. A family might have a few acres of corn, a garden that provided vegetables for the table, some hogs and chickens, and maybe a milk cow or two. Self-sufficiency was the goal, supplemented by whatever cash the timber brought in. The population of the county was maybe 12,000 in 1979, scattered across 441 square miles of territory that was more forest than farmland. The density worked out to about 27 people per square mile, enough to support a community, sparse enough that a man could find solitude when he wanted it. The roads that connected the scattered farms and homesteads were mostly unpaved, gravel and dirt that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't, navigable if you knew them, and treacherous if you didn't. The people who lived here had been here for generations, their families rooted in the land the way the pines were rooted, their relationships with each other extending back to marriages and feuds that had occurred before anyone living could remember. Newcomers were rare. Those who did arrive were regarded with a suspicion that isolated communities reserved for outsiders, watched and evaluated for years before being accepted as something other than strangers. The culture was Southern in all the ways that term implied in 1979. Conservative, religious, rooted in traditions that had survived despite the upheavals of the preceding decades. The churches were Baptist and Methodist and Primitive Baptist, their congregations overlapping with family networks and political alignments that had been stable for generations. The politics were Democratic in the old Southern sense, which meant conservative on social issues and suspicious of federal interference in local affairs. The Civil War was still discussed as if it had happened recently, its implications still debated, its outcomes still resented by those who kept the old flags and the old attitudes. But there was also a fierce independence in these communities, a distrust of authority that could cut in any direction, a conviction that a man should handle his own problems rather than relying on government or institutions to handle them for him. This was not libertarianism in any ideological sense. These were people who would have had no idea what that word meant, but rather a practical understanding born of generations of experience that outside help was rarely available, rarely effective, and often came with costs that exceeded its benefits. The Dawson property sat 15 miles northwest of McRae, at the end of a dirt road that branched off County Road 117 and wound through pine forest for 3 miles before reaching the cluster of buildings that 5 generations of Dawsons had constructed and maintained. The property was 340 acres, purchased piece by piece over a century, most of it still covered with the pine and hardwood that the family harvested on rotation. The main house was a frame structure built in 1923 by Hollis's father Ezekiel on the site of an older cabin that had become too small for the growing family. It was 2 stories with a wraparound porch on the first floor and dormer windows on the second, painted white in the style that had been fashionable when it was built, and that the family had maintained out of tradition rather than taste. Over the years, additions had been attached. A kitchen expanded in the 1940s, a bathroom added in the 1950s, a back porch enclosed in the 1960s until the structure, sprawled in several directions without any particular architectural plan. Around the main house clustered the outbuildings that any working farm required, a barn built in the 1930s after the original had burned, big enough to store equipment and hay and whatever else needed shelter from the weather, a equipment shed where tractors and trucks could be serviced and repaired, a smokehouse where meat was preserved using methods that had been practiced for centuries, various smaller structures, a chicken coop, a tool shed, an old privy that was no longer used but hadn't been torn down, because nothing on a farm was ever torn down unless absolutely necessary, and the kennels. The dog kennels occupied a cleared area behind the main house, visible from the back porch where Hollis often sat in the evenings watching the sun go down. They had been built and rebuilt over the decades, the current structure dating from 1965 when Hollis had constructed something more permanent than the makeshift pens his father had used. Chain link runs, 12 of them, each large enough for a single dog or a bitch with puppies, concrete floors that could be washed and sanitized, covered areas that provided shelter from rain and sun, everything designed for the comfort and health of the animals that represented the family's most valuable asset. In October 1979, 8 of those runs were occupied, 3 by bitches who were resting between litters, 2 by young dogs still in training, 2 by older dogs whose working days were behind them, but who had earned their retirement through years of service, and 1, the largest run, in the best position, with the most elaborate shelter, by Copper. He was there now, in the early morning of October 9th, 1979, lying in the patch of sunlight that came through the chain link, his red coat gleaming in the light, his ears perked at some sound too faint for human ears to detect. He was magnificent. There was no other word for it. And Hollis stood on the back porch watching him with the quiet satisfaction of a man looking at something he had helped create, something that would outlast him, something that represented the culmination of work that had begun before he was born. Marriage had come early for Hollis in 1939 to a woman named Edna Collins whose family had been in Telfair County almost as long as the Dawsons. He'd been 17, she'd been 16, the match unremarkable in a time and place where early marriage was common, where the transition from childhood to adulthood happened faster than modern sensibilities would allow. They'd married in the Baptist church in McRae, had moved into a small cabin on the Dawson property, had begun immediately the process of building the family that would continue the Dawson line. Curtis, the first son, arrived in 1940, born in that small cabin with the same midwife who had delivered Hollis 2 decades earlier. Virgil followed in 1942, and Dale in 1944, the family growing even as the world outside was consumed by war. When Hollis was finally drafted in 1943, he left behind a young wife and 3 small children, trusting that Edna and his aging parents could maintain the property until he returned. They had. Edna Dawson had proved herself during those years, running the farm alongside her in-laws, making decisions that would normally have fallen to her husband, raising 3 small boys with the help of neighbors and family who understood that this was what communities did when their young men were sent to war. By the time Hollis returned in 1946, she had earned a respect that transcended the usual role of a wife in that society, had demonstrated capabilities that would serve the family for decades to come. Eugene, the last son, was born in 1947, a year after Hollis's return, completing the family that would carry the Dawson name into the next generation. The 4 boys had grown up together on the property, had learned the skills their father taught them, had absorbed the values and the knowledge that defined what it meant to be a Dawson in Telfair County. Edna had been the center of that family, the force that held everything together when centrifugal pressures threatened to tear it apart. She had mediated disputes between brothers, had smoothed tensions between sons and father, had maintained the domestic sphere while the men worked the timber and hunted the woods and tended the dogs. Her death in 1972, from a cancer that had been discovered too late for treatment to make any difference, had created a void that 7 years hadn't filled. Hollis had never fully recovered from losing her. The quiet that had always been part of his character had deepened into something closer to silence. The distance that combat had created had widened until even his sons sometimes felt they were dealing with a stranger. He still worked, still made decisions, still commanded the respect that the patriarch of any family commanded. But something essential had gone out of him, something that his sons hoped might eventually return, but that showed no signs of doing so. He still found peace in the dogs. That was the one area where his old self emerged, where the knowledge and passion he'd developed over a lifetime still burned as brightly as ever. When he was working with the hounds, training them, evaluating them, discussing bloodlines, and breeding with the few people whose opinions he respected, he became again the man his sons remembered from their childhood, animated and engaged, the weight of his losses temporarily lifted, and Copper was his masterpiece. The dog represented everything Hollis knew about breeding, everything his father had known, everything 3 generations of Dawsons had accumulated through patient observation and careful selection. When Hollis watched Copper work, when he saw the dog's extraordinary abilities in action, he felt something that might have been happiness, or at least the absence of the grief that otherwise defined his days. Curtis. Dawson was 39 years old in October 1979, the oldest son, the natural heir to everything his father had built. He had been born during the tense years before America entered World War II, had grown up with a father who was sometimes present and sometimes not, had learned early the self-reliance that comes from being the oldest child in a family, where the adults had too much to do and the children were expected to contribute. He'd started working at 7, had been running equipment by 12, had been trusted with major responsibilities before most children were trusted to stay home alone. The war years had shaped him in ways he rarely discussed. He'd been old enough to understand that his father was in danger, old enough to see the fear that his mother hid from her younger children, old enough to feel responsibility for the family during the years when Hollis was overseas. He'd grown up fast, had never really had a childhood in the modern sense, had emerged from those years with a seriousness and steadiness that would define him for the rest of his life. His relationship with his father was complex, marked by respect that sometimes bordered on reverence, but also by silences that seemed to grow longer as both men aged. They understood each other without needing words, could work together for hours without speaking, communicated through actions and implications rather than direct statements. This worked well enough for the practical matters of running the property, less well for the emotional matters that lay beneath. Curtis had married in 1963, at 23, to a woman from McRae named Patricia, who had taken to the life on the Dawson property with an adaptability that earned her a place in the family. They had 2 children, a son, Thomas, now 16, and a daughter, Sarah, now 14, who represented the next generation of Dawsons, the generation that would continue the line after Curtis and his brothers were gone. He lived in a house he'd built himself on the eastern corner of the family property, close enough to the main house to be easily accessible, but far enough to provide privacy for his own family. He'd constructed it over the course of 2 years, working on weekends and evenings, using materials salvaged from the property and purchased with money he'd saved from his share of the timber income. It was modest by any standard, but it was his, and the fact that he'd built it with his own hands gave it a value that couldn't be measured in dollars. His role in the family operation was management, the coordination of work that required multiple hands, the scheduling of timber harvests, the maintenance of equipment, the 1,000 details that had to be attended to if a working farm was to function. He'd assumed these responsibilities gradually as his father withdrew, first from specific tasks and then from decision-making more generally, until Curtis was effectively running the operation, even though Hollis remained the nominal patriarch. This suited Curtis. He was not a man who sought recognition, who needed his authority acknowledged or his contributions praised. He simply did what needed to be done, solve problems as they arose, maintain the systems that his father and grandfather had established. The property was stable under his management, perhaps not growing but certainly not declining, and that was enough for a man whose ambitions had always been modest and practical. Virgil Dawson was 37 years old, the second son, different from his brother in temperament, if not in capability. Where Curtis was steady, Virgil was volatile. Where Curtis calculated before acting, Virgil followed instinct. Where Curtis sought to maintain relationships and avoid conflict, Virgil was quick to anger and slow to forgive, carrying grudges that other men would have released years earlier. The brothers loved each other in the way that brothers love each other, but they understood each other imperfectly, their different natures creating friction that never quite became open conflict, but never quite resolved either. Virgil's relationship with his father was simpler than Curtis's in some ways. They shared a passion for hunting that neither of the other brothers fully understood, a connection to the woods and the dogs that was almost mystical in its intensity. When Hollis and Virgil hunted together, the decades between them seemed to dissolve. They became partners rather than father and son, equals in pursuit of something they both valued above almost everything else. The dogs responded to Virgil in ways they didn't respond to anyone else. He had his father's gift for training, his grandfather's instinct for evaluating potential, his own particular ability to communicate with animals that seemed to border on the supernatural. A dog that refused to learn under anyone else's handling would somehow understand what Virgil wanted, would perform for him behaviors that weeks of conventional training had failed to instill. Copper was technically Virgil's dog, if any family dog could belong to a single individual. Virgil had supervised the breeding that produced him, had been present at his birth, had conducted the training that had developed his natural abilities into the skills that made him legendary. The bond between them was visible to anyone who watched them work together, the way Copper anticipated Virgil's signals, the way Virgil read Copper's body language, the wordless communication that years of partnership had created. Virgil had never married, had never shown much interest in marriage, seemed content with a solitary life that would have driven most men to distraction. He lived in a cabin he'd built on the back portion of the property, a simple structure with few amenities, accessible only by a track that was barely a road. He came to the main house for meals when he remembered to eat, participated in family gatherings when he couldn't avoid them, otherwise kept to himself, and his dogs and the endless woods that surrounded the property. Some people in the community thought there was something wrong with him, some deficiency that explained his isolation, his intensity, his inability to form the normal human connections that most people sought. But those who knew him well, his father, his brothers, the few hunters whose abilities he respected, understood that there was nothing wrong with Virgil. He was simply different, wired for a kind of life that most people couldn't understand, perfectly adapted to an environment that would have broken someone with more ordinary needs. He was also, among the 4 brothers, the most capable of violence. This wasn't something the family discussed openly, but they all knew it. The war had marked Hollis with its violence. Curtis had absorbed a kind of steadiness that resisted extremity. Dale and Eugene had never been tested by anything that demanded violence. But Virgil carried something inside him that the others didn't carry, a capacity for action that went beyond what normal circumstances required. In a crisis, he would be the one who moved first and thought later, whose instincts would take him to places that reflection would have avoided. This capacity would matter in October 1979. It would determine the family's response to what happened, would drive decisions that more cautious men might have avoided, would shape outcomes that would resonate for decades. Dale Dawson was 35 years old, the middle child, neither the oldest nor the youngest, carrying the particular invisibility that middle children often experienced. He had been born during the war, in 1944, had grown up in the aftermath of that conflict, when his father was home, but still marked by what he'd seen. He'd never felt quite as central to the family as Curtis, never as exceptional as Virgil, had carved out a role for himself in the spaces that his brothers didn't occupy. His particular talent was business, not business in the modern sense of corporate hierarchies and market strategies, but the practical commerce that any rural operation required, keeping records, managing money, dealing with buyers and sellers who needed to be cultivated and maintained. He handled the transactions that brought income to the family, the sale of timber and dogs, and the occasional surplus from the farm. He maintained the correspondence that connected the Dawson breeding program to the broader world of hunters and breeders who sought their dogs. This role kept him more connected to the world outside Telfair County than his brothers. He drove to McRae regularly, dealt with bankers and merchants and officials who were mere abstractions to Hollis and Virgil. He understood how the changing economy was affecting the family, how the timber markets were shifting, how the demand for quality hunting dogs was evolving. He brought information from the outside that helped the family adapt to changes they might otherwise have missed. He had married in 1968 to a woman named Louise who worked as a secretary at the county courthouse, whose income supplemented what the family operation provided. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, who were growing up in McRae proper, attending the town schools rather than the rural schools that Dale and his brothers had attended. The choice to live in town had caused some tension with Hollis, who felt that Dawson should live on Dawson land, but Dale had justified it on practical grounds that even his father had to acknowledge made sense. Dale drove out to the property most days, participated in the work that needed doing, maintained his connection to the family and the operation even while living at a distance. He was the bridge between the Dawsons' traditional world and the modern one that was encroaching on it, the translator who could move between contexts that his brothers didn't understand. Eugene Dawson was 32 years old, the youngest son, the one who had come closest to escaping the gravitational pull of the family and the property. He had been born after the war, in 1947, had grown up in a household that was more stable than the one his older brothers had known. By the time Eugene was old enough to remember, Hollis was home, and the farm was functioning, and the anxieties of the war years were fading into memory. He'd had something more like a normal childhood than his brothers, had been given slightly more freedom to explore interests beyond the immediate demands of the property. Those interests had centered on machines. From an early age, Eugene had been fascinated by the equipment the family used, the tractors and trucks and chainsaws, and the countless other devices that modern farming required. While his brothers learned the skills of hunting and timber work, Eugene had learned how to keep the machinery running, had developed an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that went beyond what any training could provide. He'd left Telfair County after high school, had gone to vocational school in Macon, had learned automotive mechanics in a program that promised employment in the growing economy of the 1960s. He'd worked in the city for 5 years, at a dealership that serviced cars and trucks for customers who had more money than anyone in his home county would ever have. He'd considered staying, building a life in the broader world that his childhood had barely touched. But his mother's illness had called him home. When Edna was diagnosed with cancer in 1971, Eugene had returned to help with her care, had watched her decline over the following months, had been there when she died in 1972. He'd never left again. Now he ran a small repair shop in McRae, worked on the family's equipment on weekends, served as the mechanical expertise that kept aging trucks and tractors functioning long past their expected lifespans. He'd married in 1974 to a woman named Barbara who worked at the hospital in Dublin, had no children. Yet, but expected, They would come eventually. He was settled now in a way he hadn't expected to be, rooted in the community he'd once thought he would escape, reconciled to a life that was smaller than he'd once imagined, but not necessarily worse. Among the brothers, he was the one who questioned most, who saw the world beyond Telfair County most clearly, who understood how the changes of the 1970s were affecting communities like theirs. He was also the one who adapted most easily, who could see value in new methods even when tradition argued against them, who helped the family move forward in small ways that his father and older brothers might have resisted. These four men, along with Hollis, formed the core of the Dawson family in October 1979. 5 men bound by blood and history, and the shared understanding that what they had built together mattered more than anything any of them could build alone. They were about to discover what that understanding meant in practice. They were about to learn what they would do when everything they valued was threatened. The education would be brutal, and the lesson would be written in blood. The trouble began on October 9, 1979, though the Dawsons didn't recognize it as trouble at the time. The day had started like any other October day on the property. Chores to be done, equipment to be maintained, the endless cycle of work that kept a rural operation functioning. Curtis had been supervising a timber cut on the north section, removing pines that had reached harvestable size, working with a crew of local men who hired out for such work. Virgil had been training one of the younger dogs, working on scent tracking in the fields behind the kennels. Dale had been in McRae, handling business at the bank and picking up supplies that the family needed. Eugene had been at his shop, working on a truck whose owner needed it back by the following day. Hollis had been at the main house, moving slowly through the afternoon, his back bothering him more than usual, his age making itself felt in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. He'd been sitting on the back porch, watching Copper in his kennel, when the truck appeared at the end of the road. It was a pickup. Maybe 5 years old, mud splattered in the way that vehicles in rural Georgia inevitably became, carrying license plates from Lawrence County, a county to the north, one that the Dawsons didn't have much contact with. The driver approached the main house slowly, the caution of someone entering unfamiliar territory, and parked near the front porch where visitors were expected to park. A man got out, maybe 35 years old, dressed in the work clothes that anyone in this region might wear. Jeans and a flannel shirt and boots that had seen hard use. He looked around with the open curiosity of someone taking in new surroundings, noting the buildings and the equipment and the dog kennels visible behind the house. Hollis watched from the back. Porch made no move to approach, let the visitor come to him if the visitor had business. This was the protocol in rural communities. You didn't rush to greet strangers, you let them state their purpose. You evaluated them before deciding whether to extend hospitality or suspicion. The man came around the house, following the sounds of dogs barking in the kennels, found Hollis on the porch with a glass of tea, and no particular urgency. "Afternoon," the man said. "I'm looking for the Dawson place. This it?" "This is it," Hollis said. "Help you with something?" "I hope so. Name's Rayford. I've heard about your dogs. People say you've got the best hounds in this part of Georgia. I'm looking to buy a pup, maybe a started dog if you've got one available." It was a common enough request. The Dawson breeding program attracted interest from hunters throughout the Southeast, men who had heard about the quality of the dogs and wanted to acquire one for themselves. Hollis had had this conversation hundreds of times over the years, knew the steps it would follow as well as he knew anything. "You hunt much?" he asked, the standard opening question that would tell him whether this visitor was serious or just curious. "Some. Coon and deer mostly. Been using walker hounds, but I keep hearing Redbones are better for the territory we hunt. Thought I'd come see what the fuss is about." Hollis nodded. Walkers were fine dogs, but they were bred for speed rather than endurance, for open country rather than the thick underbrush of the Georgia pine woods. A serious hunter in this region would eventually discover that Redbones were better suited to local conditions. "Dale handles the business side," Hollis said. "He's in town now, should be back by evening. You can wait if you want, or come back tomorrow." The man, Rayford, shook his head. "Can't wait too long, but if you don't mind, maybe I could look at what you got, get a sense of what might be available." It was a reasonable request, and Hollis saw no reason to refuse. He led Rayford around the house to the kennels, moving slowly because his back was still bothering him, letting the visitor see the setup that represented 60 years of Dawson investment in their breeding program. The kennels were impressive even to someone who knew nothing about dogs. The runs were clean and well-maintained, the dogs healthy and alert, the facilities obviously designed by someone who understood what animals needed. Rayford walked along the line of runs, looking at each dog, asking questions that showed some knowledge of the breed. How old is this one? What's her bloodline? Has she had litters? What were the pups like? Hollis answered patiently, recognizing the questions of a potential buyer who wanted to make an informed decision. He explained the breeding program, the qualities he selected for, the process of training that turned good dogs into exceptional ones. He talked about the litters that might be available in the coming year, the prices that were standard for dogs of this quality, the arrangements that serious buyers needed to make. And then Rayford asked about Copper. The dog was hard to miss, the largest of the Redbones, in the best kennel, with a presence that commanded attention even from people who didn't know what they were looking at. Rayford had noticed him immediately, had kept glancing back at him, even while looking at the other dogs, had clearly been working toward this question from the beginning. What about that one, the big red in the end kennel? He's something special, isn't he? Hollis felt the first faint stirring of something that wasn't quite suspicion, wasn't quite alarm, just a heightened awareness that this conversation might be heading somewhere he didn't want it to go. That's Copper, he said. He's not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price, Rayford said. And the way he said it, casual, confident, like it was a simple truth that anyone would acknowledge, made Hollis's warning sense strengthen. Not Copper, he's family. Rayford laughed, the laugh of a man who found something amusing but not funny. Family, sure. But what if someone offered, I don't know, $20,000 for him? 30? That's a lot of money for a dog. It is, Hollis agreed. And people have offered it. The answer was no then, and it's no now. Something shifted in Rayford's expression, a flicker of something that came and went too fast to identify. He nodded, seemingly accepting the refusal, turned his attention back to the other dogs. Well, what about one of his pups? You said he's been bred. Any of his offspring available? Not right now. The last litter went to buyers who'd been waiting 2 years. There's a waiting list for the next one. Could I get on that list? Talk to Dale. He handles the business. The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, Rayford asking more questions about the property, the breeding program, the logistics of acquiring a Dawson dog. He seemed particularly interested in the layout of the property, which roads led where, when the family was typically present, how the security of the kennels was maintained. At the time, Hollis noticed these questions without assigning them special significance. People who were serious about buying dogs often asked about security, wanting to know that their investment would be protected. People who were unfamiliar with the property naturally asked about access and navigation. There was nothing overtly suspicious about anything Rayford said, but later, when the significance became clear, Hollis would remember every question, would remember how Rayford's eyes had lingered on Copper's kennel, would remember the particular way he'd noted the path from the main road to the kennels, would remember that what had seemed like innocent curiosity was actually reconnaissance. Rayford left around 4 p.m., saying he'd be in touch about getting on the waiting list for puppies. He drove away in his Lawrence County truck, and Hollis watched him go with a faint unease that would only intensify as the days passed. Dale returned from town that evening, and Hollis mentioned the visitor in passing. A man from Lawrence County, interested in dogs, asked a lot of questions about Copper. Dale noted the information, said he'd see if the man followed through about the puppy list, thought nothing more about it. Neither of them understood that they had just been scouted by someone planning the theft that would trigger everything that followed. The days between Rayford's visit and Copper's disappearance passed without incident. The family continued their routines, timber work and dog training, and the countless small tasks that kept the property functioning. The hunting season opened in early October, and the Dawsons began the activities that defined their autumns, taking the dogs out in the evenings, pursuing the raccoons and opossums that were both quarry and practice for the dogs' developing skills. Copper was the star of every hunt. His nose was extraordinary, picking up trails that other dogs missed entirely, following scent that might be 12 or 18 or 24 hours old. His voice was clear and carrying, audible for miles through the pine forests, immediately recognizable to anyone who knew his sound. His stamina was remarkable. He could work for 6 or 8 hours without flagging, outlasting dogs half his age. Virgil and Copper worked together with the wordless communication that developed between exceptional dogs and exceptional handlers. They anticipated each other's movements, understood each other's signals, functioned as a single unit rather than two separate beings. Watching them work was watching something that approached art, the kind of partnership that could take a decade to develop and that most hunters never achieved with any dog in their entire lives. The hunt on the night of October 13th was particularly successful. The family had gone out around 8 p.m., working the woods north of the property where raccoons were plentiful this time of year. Copper had treed 3 coons in 4 hours, his baying carrying through the forest each time he pinned his quarry, the sound that every coon hunter lived to hear. The other dogs had performed well too, but Copper was clearly the best, clearly the animal around which the entire pack oriented itself. They'd returned around 1 a.m., tired and satisfied, had kenneled the dogs and gone to their beds without any sense that something was wrong. The security was what it had always been. Padlocks on the kennel gates, dogs that would bark at any intrusion, the assumption that no one would be foolish enough to steal from the Dawsons. That assumption was wrong. The theft occurred sometime between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m., during the hours when even the most vigilant security gave way to exhaustion. Hollis woke at his usual time, 5:30, made coffee, dressed, walked out to check on the dogs, the way he did every morning. The first thing he noticed was the silence. The dogs usually started barking as soon as they heard him coming, the pack response that alerted everyone to activity. This morning, they were quiet, a silence that seemed wrong even before Hollis consciously identified why. The second thing he noticed was Copper's gate. It was closed but unlatched, the padlock lying in the dirt, cut cleanly through. The pen was empty. Hollis stood there for what felt like a long time, though it was probably only seconds, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were telling him. Copper was always there. Copper had been there every morning for 5 years. The possibility that he might not be there was so far outside Hollis's experience that his brain simply refused to process it. He whistled, the call that should have brought Copper running from anywhere on the property. There was no response. He called the dog's name, his voice carrying across the silent morning. Nothing. He searched the kennel area, thinking maybe Copper had escaped and was nearby. Maybe the cut lock was a prank or a mistake. He searched the yards around the main house. He searched the outbuildings. He searched everywhere he could think to look. Copper was gone. Someone had come in the night, had cut the lock on his kennel, had taken the most valuable dog the family had ever produced, had walked onto the property while the family slept, had violated their space, had stolen something that represented 60 years of work and generations of accumulated knowledge. The fury that built in Hollis's chest was unlike anything he'd felt since the war. It was hot and cold simultaneously, burning and frozen. The kind of rage that doesn't diminish with time, but crystallizes into something harder and more permanent than passion. He woke his sons. Curtis arrived first, having seen his father crossing the property in the early light. He took in the situation immediately. The cut lock, the empty pen, the expression on Hollis's face that told him everything he needed to know. "How long?" Curtis asked. "Sometime in the night, after we kenneled him." "Anyone see anything, hear anything?" Hollis shook his head. The other dogs hadn't barked, which suggested the intruder knew how to handle animals, knew how to approach without triggering the alarm that the pack should have provided. Virgil arrived next, having walked over from his cabin when he heard the commotion. His reaction was different from Curtis's, less analytical, more visceral, his face going still in a way that anyone who knew him would recognize as dangerous. "Who?" was all he said. "Don't know yet." "I'll find out." Dale and Eugene came together, driving up from their homes when Curtis called them. The 4 brothers and their father stood by the empty kennel in the morning light, looking at the evidence of violation, saying little because there was little to say. The sheriff's department was called. A deputy arrived around 9 a.m., took a report, asked questions, examined the scene. He was sympathetic but realistic. Dog theft was not a priority for a department with limited resources. The chances of recovery were small. The best the family could hope for was that the thief would try to sell Copper somewhere he could be recognized. "We'll put out word," the deputy said. "Contact other departments. Let people know what to look for. But honestly, these things usually don't get solved. I'm sorry." Hollis nodded, thanked the deputy, watched him drive away. He hadn't expected anything different. The law was a tool that worked for some things and not for others. that protected some people and not others, that functioned according to priorities that had nothing to do with what mattered to the Dawsons. "We'll find him ourselves," Virgil said, when the deputy was gone. No one disagreed. The Dawsons began their own investigation within hours of discovering the theft. Virgil took the lead, his hunter's instincts applying themselves to a different kind of tracking. He examined the ground around the kennel with the same attention he'd apply to a trail in the woods, reading signs that others would have missed. The tracks told a story. Vehicle tracks, approaching the kennel area from the back road that led to the property, the route a stranger might use if they didn't want to come up the main drive. Footprints around Copper's pen, suggesting at least two people, one to handle the lock, another to handle the dog. The marks in the dirt where Copper had been led away, resisting slightly but not fighting, suggesting he'd been drugged or somehow neutralized before being moved. The other dogs hadn't barked during the theft. This bothered Virgil more than almost anything else. Dawson dogs were supposed to alert to intruders, were supposed to protect the property and each other. Their silence suggested something sophisticated, drugged meat thrown to distract them, perhaps, or simply an intruder who knew how to approach without triggering alarm. Dale's mind went to the visitor from 4 days earlier, Rayford with his questions about Copper and his interest in the property layout. The timing was too coincidental. The questions had been too specific. The way Rayford had noted the path from the main road to the kennels suddenly seemed much more significant. "He was scouting," Dale said. "Everything he asked was about how to get in here, when we'd be gone, how the security worked." Virgil nodded, his expression hard. "Then we find him." Curtis made calls to the network of hunters and dog breeders that existed throughout the region. Within hours, word was spreading that Copper had been stolen, that the Dawsons were looking for information, that anyone who knew anything should come forward. The hunting community was small enough that news traveled fast. By evening, they had their first lead. A man in Loren County, the county whose plates Rayford's truck had carried, reported that he'd heard something disturbing. A group of men he knew slightly, men with a reputation for dealing in stolen goods, had been talking about acquiring a high-quality hunting dog. They'd been looking for something exceptional, something that would command a premium price from buyers who didn't ask questions about provenance. The name attached to the rumor was McKinnon, Garland McKinnon to be specific. A man whose reputation in Lawrence County was well established, who was known for various illegal enterprises that ranged from drug dealing to theft to fencing stolen goods. He operated with a crew that included his brothers and various associates, perhaps 12 to 15 men total, enough muscle to discourage anyone who might think about interfering with his activities. The Dawsons had heard the name before. McKinnon had been connected to other thefts in the region, other animals that had disappeared from farms and kennels, other property that had been taken and sold before owners could recover it. He operated in the shadows that existed in any rural community, the informal economy that existed alongside the legitimate one, the network of people willing to profit from other people's losses. "He'll try to sell him," Curtis said when they'd gathered the information. "A dog like Copper, he knows what it's worth. He'll find a buyer, someone with money who doesn't care where the dog came from. Then we get him back before that happens," Virgil said. "How? We don't know where they're keeping him. We don't know when they're planning to sell. We don't have any proof that McKinnon was involved." "We'll get proof." Virgil's voice was flat, certain. "And then we'll get Copper back." The next 2 days were spent gathering more information. Virgil drove to Lawrence County, scouted the area where McKinnon was known to operate. He found the compound where the organization was based, a rundown farm outside a community called Montrose, trailers and outbuildings and the debris of various illegal enterprises. He watched from a distance, counting men and vehicles, mapping the layout, looking for any sign of Copper among the dogs that were kept on the property. He found him on the second day. The kennel behind the main house held perhaps a dozen dogs, various breeds and conditions, the kind of mixed collection that suggested animals acquired from multiple sources. And in a pen at the far end, separated from the others, was Copper, his distinctive red coat visible even from a quarter mile away, his posture subdued in a way that suggested he knew something was wrong. Virgil watched for hours, noting how many men came and went, what their routines seemed to be, how the security of the property was maintained. He counted 8 different individuals during his surveillance, all armed, all moving with the confidence of men who didn't expect to be challenged. 8 men. against 5 Dawsons. The arithmetic was unfavorable, but arithmetic had never stopped the Dawsons before. On the evening of October 16th, Hollis gathered his sons at the main house. They sat on the porch as darkness fell, the same porch where generations of Dawsons had made decisions about things that mattered, the same porch where Hollis's father and grandfather had sat before him. "We know who has him," Hollis said. "We know where they're keeping him. The question is what we do about it." "We go get him," Virgil said immediately. 8 men that we've counted, maybe more, armed, on their own territory. We've faced worse odds. This was true in a sense. The Dawsons had never faced exactly this situation, but they had faced situations where determination and knowledge of terrain had mattered more than numbers. They had generations of experience hunting in these woods, tracking and pursuing in conditions that most men couldn't handle. They had the patience that hunting required, the ability to wait for exactly the right moment. They had each other, the coordination that came from working together for decades. "We can't just go in shooting," Curtis said, the practical concern that needed to be voiced. "Even if we got Copper back, they'd come after us. And if we didn't get him back, if something went wrong, we'd be dead or in prison. So we don't go in shooting," Virgil said. "We do what we do best. We hunt them." The room went quiet as the implications settled. Hunting wasn't a metaphor for Virgil. It was a methodology, a way of approaching problems that the family understood deeply. You didn't run a quarry head-on. You tracked it, studied it, understood its patterns. You reduced its options, cut off its escape routes, positioned yourself for the moment when the kill became possible. "One at a time," Virgil continued. "Pick them off when they're alone, when they're vulnerable. Reduce their numbers until we can move on the main target." "That's murder," Dale said, the word hanging in the air. "What you're describing is murder. They came onto our land, took what was ours. If we let them get away with it, what's to stop them from coming back? What's to stop someone else from trying the same thing?" Hollis had been quiet, listening to his son's debate, his expression unreadable. Now he spoke. "The law won't help us. We've seen that. Even if they find Copper, even if they can prove McKinnon took him, what happens? He gets a fine, maybe a few months in jail. Copper ends up in evidence somewhere, and we might never get him back." He paused, looking at each of his sons in turn. "These men didn't just steal a dog. They violated everything we've built. They came into our home and took something that can't be replaced. If we let that stand, we're telling the world that the Dawsons can be taken from, that everything our family has built over 5 generations is there for the taking." "So what are you saying?" Eugene asked, the youngest, the one who understood least about the codes that govern this decision. "I'm saying that some things matter more than the law. Some things can only be settled between the people involved." Hollis's voice was heavy, carrying the weight of what he was authorizing. "If we decide to do this, we do it right. No half measures, no witnesses, no evidence. We finish what they started." The silence that followed was the silence of men facing a choice that would define the rest of their lives. Each of them understood what was being proposed. Each of them understood the consequences, legal, moral, practical. Each of them had the opportunity to object, to propose alternatives, to walk away from what was being planned. None of them did. By the time the October sun had fully set, the Dawson family had made their decision. They would get Copper back, and they would make certain that no one would ever try something similar again. The planning began that night. The killing would begin 2 days later. The next 48 hours were devoted to preparation. The family divided responsibilities according to their abilities. Virgil continued his reconnaissance, returning to Loren County to observe the McKinnon compound, to map the movements of the men they would be targeting. Curtis handled logistics, weapons, vehicles, routes of approach, and escape. Dale gathered information through his network of contacts, trying to identify every member of the McKinnon organization. Eugene prepared the equipment, ensuring that vehicles were functioning and supplies were ready. Hollis coordinated everything, reviewing plans, identifying weaknesses, making the final decisions that would govern the operation. The weapons they would need were readily available. The Dawsons owned multiple rifles and shotguns, the ordinary armament of a hunting family, weapons that had been used for decades to take game and protect the property. Hollis had a pistol he'd carried since the war, a Colt 1911 that had traveled with him from Georgia to France and back. Curtis owned a 30-30 lever action that was ideal for the medium-range work they anticipated. Virgil had a scoped rifle for distance shooting, plus a hunting knife that he'd carried for 30 years. Dale and Eugene contributed what they had, building an arsenal that was modest by military standards, but adequate for the work they were planning. Ammunition was stockpiled, enough for an extended operation. Maps were created, showing the McKinnon compound and the surrounding territory. Routes were planned, approach routes, escape routes, contingency routes for scenarios that might disrupt the primary plan. The intelligence that Dale gathered through his contacts was crucial. The McKinnon organization included perhaps 14 men total, though not all of them were equally involved or equally dangerous. Garland McKinnon was the leader, 52 years old, the driving force behind the organization's activities. His younger brother Porter was 47, second in command, handling the operational details that Garland didn't want to bother with. A third brother, Vernon, had died 3 years earlier, but his sons, 2 young men in their 20s, remained involved in the family business. Beyond the family core, the organization included various associates of different levels of involvement. Some were longtime members, trusted with significant responsibilities. Others were hired muscle, brought in for specific operations. Still others were peripheral figures who might or might not be considered full members, depending on how you counted. The Dawsons identified 14 men who were definitely involved in the organization, definitely complicit in its activities, definitely present in the rotation of faces that came and went from the compound. These 14 became the targets, the quarry that the Dawson family would hunt across the next 13 days. Rayford was among them, the scout who had visited the Dawson property, who had gathered the information that made the theft possible. His presence on the list was certain from the moment they began planning. He had walked onto their land, had looked at their dogs, had asked questions whose purpose was now clear. He would pay for that reconnaissance with his life. The plan that emerged was based on principles the Dawsons understood instinctively. Don't attack strength. The McKinnon compound was defended, the men inside armed and numerous. A direct assault would be costly at best, catastrophic at worst. Instead, they would attack weakness. The moments when members of the organization were alone, away from backup, vulnerable to men who knew how to approach unseen. Be patient. The work would take as long as it took. Rushing would create risks that patience could avoid. Better to spend an extra day, an extra week, than to make a mistake that could never be corrected. Leave no evidence. Every kill would be clean, every body disposed of in ways that would resist discovery. The sinkhole on the Dawson property, a geological feature that had existed for centuries, a shaft in the limestone that descended into darkness from which nothing returned, would receive the evidence of what they did. The forest would claim what the sinkhole couldn't. Send a message. The McKinnon organization needed to understand that they had made a fatal error. The disappearances needed to be connected in ways that would cause fear, that would make the survivors understand what was happening, even if they couldn't stop it. Let them know they were being hunted. Let them feel the terror that prey feels when the hunter is close. The operation would begin on October 18th, 4 days after Copper's theft. The first target had already been selected. A man named Wesley Tanner, 29 years old, one of McKinnon's drivers, responsible for transporting goods between locations. Tanner was chosen because he was vulnerable. He drove alone, often at night, taking routes that passed through isolated territory. He was young and careless, had probably never faced serious danger, wouldn't be expecting an ambush. In the quiet countryside, he traveled regularly. He would learn. Briefly, the afternoon of October 18th, 1979, was warm for October, the temperature reaching into the low 70s under a sky that was perfectly clear. Dale and Eugene had positioned themselves on the route that Tanner regularly traveled, a back road between Dublin and Vidalia that passed through miles of territory with no houses, no businesses, nothing but pine forest pressing close on both sides. They'd been there since noon, watching the occasional vehicle pass, waiting for the truck that matched the description Virgil had provided. The method was simple, adapted from techniques the family had used for decades in different contexts. A vehicle was parked across the road, hood up. One man standing beside it with the universal body language of someone experiencing mechanical trouble. Any passing driver would have a choice. stop to help, or squeeze past on the narrow shoulder. Most drivers in rural Georgia would stop. It was what neighbors did for each other, what the culture demanded. Tanner stopped. His truck was a Ford pickup, maybe 5 years old, the kind of vehicle that anyone in the region might drive. He got out with the casual confidence of a young man who had never learned to fear, walked toward the apparently disabled vehicle, called out asking what the trouble was. He didn't see Eugene moving through the trees behind him, didn't hear the footsteps that years of hunting had taught Eugene to make silent, didn't know anything was wrong until the moment when everything was wrong. The attack was swift and brutal. Tanner tried to turn, tried to reach for the pistol that was under the seat of his truck, tried to do something that might save his life. He failed at all of it. Within 30 seconds of stopping his vehicle, he was dead, his body being loaded into his own truck. His life ended by men he'd never seen and would never understand. The disposal took longer than the killing. They drove Tanner's truck deep into the pine forests of Telfair County, following tracks that only the Dawsons knew, arriving eventually at the sinkhole that would receive their work. The sinkhole was a geological feature that had been on the property for as long as anyone could remember. A shaft in the limestone that descended perhaps 100 feet into darkness. Things that went into it didn't come out. Animals that fell in were never recovered. The physics of the thing, the depth, the narrowness, the water that filled the lower reaches, made it perfect for purposes that the Dawsons had never contemplated before, but that the current situation required. Tanner's body went into the sinkhole. His truck was driven in a different direction, abandoned in a location that would suggest he'd been heading towards Savannah, that would create a false trail for anyone trying to investigate his disappearance. By the time darkness fell on October 18th, the first target had been eliminated. The McKinnon organization had lost a member, and they didn't even know it yet. 1 down, 13 to go. The Dawsons waited 3 days before striking again. The interval was deliberate. They needed time for Tanner's disappearance to be noticed, for confusion to spread through the McKinnon organization, for the targets to settle back into routines that would provide new opportunities. During this interval, Virgil continued his surveillance, watching the compound, noting the reactions to Tanner's absence. The organization was concerned but not alarmed. Men like Tanner sometimes disappeared, sometimes ran with money that wasn't theirs, sometimes simply decided to start over somewhere else. The assumption was that something like that had happened, that Tanner had betrayed them rather than been eliminated. This assumption worked in the Dawsons' favor. It kept the organization from going on alert, kept them following patterns that could be exploited, gave the hunters time to select their next targets. On the night of October 21st, Curtis and Virgil waited in the parking lot of a bar outside Dublin. The targets were 2 brothers named Holcomb, 34 and 31 years old, who worked for McKinnon as enforcers. They were the men who handled situations that required violence, who beat people who owed money, who intimidated those who considered resisting. They were dangerous, more so than Tanner had been, but they had weaknesses that could be exploited. The weakness was alcohol. The Holcomb brothers drank heavily and frequently, their bar visits providing windows of vulnerability that sober men wouldn't have offered. Tonight they were at the Dublin bar, had been there since 8 p.m., had consumed enough that their reflexes would be impaired and their judgment compromised. Curtis and Virgil waited in the darkness of the parking lot, watching the door, patient in the way that decades of hunting had made them patient. The brothers emerged around 11:30 p.m., drunk, unsteady, alone, because the friends who might have been with them had left earlier. They made their way toward their truck, fumbling for keys, laughing at something one of them had said. They never reached the truck. The assault was quick, brutal, efficient. 2 men, drunk and unsuspecting, against 2 men who were sober, skilled, and had been waiting hours for this moment. The outcome was never in doubt. 2 more bodies for the sinkhole. 2 fewer members of the McKinnon organization. 3 down, 11 to go. The response from McKinnon was faster this time. 3 men missing in 4 days was too many to be coincidence, too concentrated to be attributed to chance. Garland McKinnon called the meeting of his remaining people, tried to determine what was happening, who might be targeting them, how to protect against threats they couldn't identify. But the theories they developed were wrong. They looked for enemies from the drug trade, rivals who might be moving to eliminate competition. They looked for former associates who might be seeking revenge for past grievances. They looked everywhere except the direction the threat was actually coming from, a family of dog breeders in Telfair County, ordinary people who had decided that extraordinary measures were required. The fourth target was Rayford. He was chosen not for logistical reasons, but for personal ones. This was the man who had walked onto the Dawson property, who had looked at their dogs with calculating eyes, who had asked questions that were designed to facilitate theft rather than purchase. He had violated the hospitality that the family had extended, had used their openness against them. Among all the McKinnon associates, he was the one the Dawsons wanted most. The operation to take him was more complex than the previous ones because Rayford lived with his family, a wife and 2 children who were not targets, who were not involved in his activities, who the Dawsons had no intention of harming. On the night of October 23rd, all 4 brothers participated in the operation. Hollis stayed at the family property, establishing an alibi, demonstrating that at least one Dawson was definitely not involved in whatever was happening in Lawrence County. They approached Rayford's house around 2 a.m. when the household would be sleeping most deeply. 2 brothers secured the exterior, watching for any sign of alarm. 2 brothers entered, moving quietly through rooms they'd never seen before, following a floor plan they had guessed from the exterior. The family was asleep. The wife was secured first, bound and gagged but unharmed, her terrified eyes visible above the cloth that covered her mouth. The children's rooms were checked, their doors closed quietly, their sleep preserved. Virgil took Rayford from his bed, a hand over his mouth to prevent screaming, a knife at his throat to ensure compliance. They moved him to the living room, where the conversation that followed was brief and brutal. Rayford confirmed what they already knew. McKinnon had ordered the theft. The dog was still at the compound. The plan was to sell him to a buyer in Florida who had cash and didn't ask questions. The information gathered, Rayford's usefulness ended. He joined the others in the sinkhole before dawn. His wife was discovered the next morning, bound but alive, hysterical with terror. She told police that masked men had taken her husband, couldn't identify them, couldn't explain why. The investigation that followed led nowhere. 4 down, 10 to go. The McKinnon organization was in chaos. 4 men missing in 6 days, including one of Garland's most trusted scouts. The pattern was too clear to be coincidence, too targeted to be random violence. Someone was hunting them, picking them off one by one, and no one could identify who or why. Garland ordered increased security. His remaining people were to travel in groups, never alone. They were to stay armed at all times. They were to avoid locations where they might be vulnerable. The compound was to be fortified, watches established, every approach covered. These precautions made the next operations more difficult, but not impossible. The Dawsons adapted, looking for opportunities that the new security couldn't cover. Men who had to work, who had to move, who couldn't stay inside the compound indefinitely. Moments of carelessness that even the most vigilant security couldn't prevent entirely. On October 25th, a man named Lassiter was caught alone on a rural road, having broken discipline to visit a woman his wife didn't know about. He died wondering how they had found him. On October 27th, 2 men named Crowell and Boggs made the mistake of traveling to Augusta for a business deal, thinking that distance from home meant safety. The Dawsons had followed them, waited for the right moment, made certain they never returned. By October 28th, 7 members of the McKinnon organization were dead. The survivors were terrified. The compound had become a fortress, but a fortress from which they couldn't emerge, in which they were effectively imprisoned by their own fear. Garland McKinnon understood now that he was facing something unprecedented, something that the ordinary precautions couldn't stop. He tried to determine who was responsible. The investigation led him eventually to the Dawsons, the stolen dog, the timing, the obvious motive. But understanding who was responsible didn't tell him how to stop them. The Dawsons were invisible, striking without warning, disappearing without trace. The bodies of his people were never found, leaving no evidence, no leads, nothing that could be used to respond. On October 28th, Garland McKinnon made a decision that would define his final days. He sent a message through intermediaries, offering to negotiate. The dog could be returned. Compensation could be paid. The conflict could end if the Dawsons were willing to accept terms. The message reached Hollis through channels that neither side would ever fully disclose. He read it on the evening of October 28th, sitting on the porch where generations of Dawsons had made decisions, looking out at the property that 5 generations had built. The offer was rejected. It was too late for negotiation, too late for terms, too late for anything except the conclusion that had been inevitable from the moment the Dawsons decided to act. 7 men were dead, 7 men whose deaths could never be undisclosed, whose elimination committed the family to completing what they'd started. "They'll be expecting us now," Curtis said. "They know who we are, what we're doing. Going after the rest will be harder." "Then we make it count," Virgil said. "One operation, all of them at once." The planning for the final assault began that night. The McKinnon compound had 7 men remaining: Garland himself, his brother Porter, Vernon's 2 sons, and 3 associates whose loyalty had survived the decimation of the organization. They had armed themselves, had fortified their positions, had prepared for an assault they knew was coming. But 7 men couldn't watch every approach. 7 men couldn't maintain vigilance indefinitely. 7 men, no matter how determined, couldn't overcome the advantages that the Dawsons possessed: knowledge of rural warfare, patience beyond what their enemies could match, and the absolute commitment that came from fighting for something that mattered more than life. The assault was planned for the early hours of October 29th, the time when human alertness reached its lowest ebb. All 5 Dawsons participated. Hollis insisted on being there despite his age, despite the concerns his sons expressed. This was his family's fight, his dog, his legacy. He would be there when it ended. They approached from 4 directions, using the darkness as cover, moving through terrain that decades of hunting had taught them to navigate. Each man knew his assignment, his approach route, his role in the coordinated attack that would end the McKinnon organization. Curtis and Virgil took the primary approach, moving toward the front of the compound where the main structures stood. Dale and Eugene circled to the rear, toward the kennels where Copper was held. Hollis positioned himself on the perimeter, covering the escape route that anyone fleeing the compound would have to use. The first sentry died silently, taken by Virgil from behind, the kill clean and quick. The second sentry followed moments later, Curtis's work equally professional. The breach of the main house was simultaneous, the brothers entering from multiple directions, moving through the structure with speed that didn't allow response. The fighting was brief and decisive. 7 men, awakened from sleep, some of them drunk, none of them prepared for the violence that had arrived. Against them, 5 men who had been planning this moment for days, who knew exactly what they were doing, who had already killed 7 of their enemies, and were prepared to kill the rest. Garland McKinnon died in the kitchen. Reaching for a weapon, he never managed to fire. Porter died in the hallway, caught between attackers. Vernon's sons died in their bedrooms, unable to organize a defense against men who were already among them. The 3 associates died in the chaos that followed, each in their own location, each in their own way. By 4 a.m. on October 29th, the McKinnon organization had ceased to exist. 14 men, dead over 13 days. A message delivered that no one who heard it would ever forget. And in the kennel behind the house, Copper was barking, recognizing voices and scents that were familiar, not understanding what had happened, but knowing that something had changed. Dale retrieved him, while the others dealt with the aftermath. The dog was thin, had clearly not been fed properly, showed signs of the stress and neglect that 2 weeks of captivity had inflicted. But he was alive. He was still Copper. And when Dale opened the kennel gate, when Copper saw the men who had come for him, the tail began to wag. Some things remained constant. Some bonds couldn't be broken by theft or mistreatment. The cleanup took until dawn. 7 more bodies were transported to the sinkhole that now held 14 men. The compound was searched, evidence destroyed, the scene arranged to suggest flight rather than slaughter. By the time the sun rose, there was nothing left to find. The Dawson family returned to their property, Copper in his kennel, the operation complete. They had gotten their dog back. They had eliminated the threat to their family and their legacy. They had demonstrated, in the most definitive way possible, that the Dawsons could not be taken from with impunity. The price had been 14 lives. The benefit was a future that remained possible. Whether the exchange was worth it was a question that each of them would answer for himself in the years that followed, in the silence of his own conscience. The bodies were never found. The sinkhole that held them was on remote Dawson property, accessible only by tracks that no one outside the family knew about. The geology of the thing, limestone that dissolved slowly in acidic groundwater, creating shafts that descended into underground rivers that flowed toward the coast, ensured that whatever was deposited there would never resurface. The 14 men who had died simply vanished, their bodies becoming part of the geological processes that had been shaping this land for millions of years. But their absence was noticed. It was impossible for 14 men to disappear from a community without someone asking questions, without families wondering where their sons and brothers had gone, without the casual connections of daily life revealing gaps that had to be explained. The investigation began in early November 1979, when the cumulative absences became too significant to ignore. Sheriff's deputies in Loran County received multiple missing person reports over the course of a week. Wives who hadn't seen their husbands, parents who couldn't reach their sons, employers whose workers had stopped showing up. The reports came from different locations, different social circles, different aspects of life in rural Georgia. But when detectives began comparing them, a pattern emerged. All of the missing men were connected to the McKinnon organization. All of them had disappeared within a 2-week period. All of them had vanished without trace. No bodies, no vehicles, no evidence of what had happened to them. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation was called in when the scope of the situation became clear. Agent Harold Patterson was assigned to lead the investigation, a veteran of 20 years, with the GBI who had worked cases throughout the state. Patterson was methodical, patient, experienced enough to recognize that this case was unlike anything he'd handled before. 14 men connected to a criminal organization, all disappeared within 13 days, no evidence, no witnesses, no obvious explanation. The theories that might explain such a pattern were all disturbing. A rival organization eliminating competition with thoroughness that suggested professional capability. Internal conflict, members of the McKinnon organization turning on each other with results that no one had survived to report. Or something else. A possibility that Patterson began to consider as his investigation progressed, as the connections between the victims and their activities became clearer. The stolen dog came up during the second week of investigation. A deputy in Telfair County mentioned it in response to a routine inquiry. A Dawson dog, stolen in October, the timing coinciding with the disappearances. The Dawson family was known in the region, respected for their dogs, connected to a network of hunters who extended across multiple counties. Patterson made the connection that others had missed. He began investigating the Dawsons with the careful attention that his training demanded. The circumstantial case was strong. Motive, the theft of a dog that the family valued above almost everything else. Opportunity, the Dawsons knew the territory where the disappearances had occurred, had the skills to operate there undetected. Means, a hunting family would have weapons, would have the knowledge to use them effectively. And the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. The disappearances beginning just days after the theft, ending when all 14 members of the organization were gone. But circumstantial cases required evidence, and evidence was precisely what Patterson couldn't find. He visited the Dawson property on November 20th, accompanied by deputies from Telfair County. They found Hollis on the porch, waiting, as if he had known they were coming. The conversation was polite but unproductive. Hollis answered questions with the careful precision of a man who understood what was being asked and why. Yes, their dog had been stolen. Yes, they'd reported it to the sheriff. Yes, the dog had eventually been found, had returned on his own, Hollis said, after escaping from wherever he'd been held. No, they didn't know anything about the missing men. No, they hadn't been to Lawrence County recently. No, they had no idea what might have happened to the McKinnon organization. Patterson knew he was being lied to. Every instinct he'd developed over 20 years told him that Hollis Dawson was concealing the truth about what had happened in October. But instinct wasn't evidence, and evidence was what he needed to build a case. He ordered a search of the property, the deputies spreading out to examine buildings and vehicles, and anything else that might contain relevant information. They found nothing, no weapons that showed signs of recent violence, no vehicles that could be connected to the disappearances, no clothing, no documents, no physical evidence of any kind. The sinkhole wasn't searched. No one knew it. Existed, buried deep in the property, accessible only by tracks that the deputies never found. The secret remained secret. Patterson left the Dawson property that day with the certainty that he knew what had happened, and the frustration of knowing he could never prove it. The investigation would continue for months, would generate reports and theories and dead ends, would never produce the evidence necessary for prosecution. The case was eventually classified as unsolved. The file was thick with documentation, interviews, forensic reports, analyses that had led nowhere. The conclusion, stated in the dry language of official reports, was that unknown persons had eliminated the McKinnon organization for unknown reasons, and that without additional evidence, prosecution was impossible. Agent Patterson retired in 1995 after a career that had included many successes, but also this one significant failure. In interviews after his retirement, he sometimes mentioned the case, the one that got away, the one where he knew the answer but couldn't prove it. "The Dawsons did it," he would say to journalists or researchers who asked. "I'm as sure of that as I've been of anything in my career, but sure isn't proof. The law requires proof, and proof is what we never found." The Dawson family resumed their life as if nothing had happened. Copper recovered over the following months. The weight came back, the energy returned, the spirit that captivity had damaged gradually reasserted itself. By the spring of 1980, he was hunting again, performing at the level that had made him legendary, the trauma of his captivity fading into memory. He lived until 1986, dying at the age of 12, a long life for a working hound. His final years were good ones: continued hunting, continued breeding, continued existence as the center of an operation that valued him above almost everything else. When he died, he was buried on the Dawson property in a spot overlooking the kennels where he'd lived, a marker placed above the grave that would remain for decades. The puppies he sired continued his legacy. 7 more litters, dozens of offspring, a bloodline that extended the qualities that had made Copper exceptional into the next generation and beyond. The Dawson breeding program continued, producing dogs that remained sought after throughout the Southeast. The reputation that Ezekiel had begun and that Copper had embodied carrying forward into the future. The family members aged as everyone does. Hollis Dawson died in 1991 at the age of 69. The lung cancer that killed him had probably been building for years, but he'd refused to see doctors until it was too late. He died in the house where he'd been born, surrounded by his sons and their families, and he's looking out at the property that 5 generations of Dawsons had called home. He never spoke about October 1979, not even to his sons. Whatever he felt about what they had done, guilt, satisfaction, ambivalence, he carried it to his grave without sharing. The silence that had defined his later years extended to the end, and perhaps beyond. Curtis Dawson died in 2004 at the age of 64. A heart attack took him while he was working on the property, cutting timber that he'd been managing for decades. He collapsed in the forest he knew better than anyone, was found hours later by his son Thomas, was buried beside his parents in the family plot. He had taken over leadership of the family after Hollis's death, had managed the property and the breeding program with the same steady competence he'd always shown. He had never married again after Patricia died in 1998, had lived alone in the house he'd built, had found whatever peace he was going to find in the work that had defined his entire life. Virgil Dawson died in 2011 at the age of 69. He had never married, had never left the property, had lived in the cabin he'd built until the end. His body was found by a nephew who checked on him when he didn't appear for a family gathering, sitting in the chair by the window, where he'd spent so many evenings watching the darkness gather over the pines. He had remained the best hunter of his generation, had continued working the dogs in the woods until age made it impossible. The bond between him and the land had never weakened, had defined him until the end, had been the only relationship he'd ever truly needed. Dale Dawson died in 2018 at the age of 74. A stroke had confined him to a nursing home in McRae for his final years, his mind fading. The memories of October 1979 presumably lost among all the other memories that dementia erased. His family hoped that was true, hoped that the weight he'd carried had dissolved along with everything else. Eugene Dawson is still alive as of 2024, 77 years old, the last surviving member of the group that conducted the operation of 1979. He lives in McRae, in the same house he's occupied for 40 years. His health is declining, but his mind remains sharp. He doesn't speak about the past, deflects any questions about the events of that October, maintains the silence that is held for 45 years. The knowledge of what happened has been passed down, carefully and selectively. The current generation of Dawsons, grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the men who killed 14 people in 13 days, knows the story, or knows the shape of it. They understand that something occurred in 1979 that can never be discussed outside the family. That must be protected the way all family secrets must be protected. They maintain the silence. They continue the traditions. They breed dogs that still carry the genetics of copper, that still perform with the excellence that generations of careful selection have produced. And they remember, even as the world forgets. 45 years have passed since October 1979. The world has changed in ways that Hollis Dawson couldn't have imagined. Technology has transformed every aspect of life, including the ways that secrets are kept and discovered. The isolation that once protected rural communities has been eroded by constant connectivity, by cameras and databases, and the digital traces that modern existence leaves behind. But the Georgia pines remain. They grow slowly, adding rings that record the passage of years, standing as witnesses to events that their non-human consciousness can't record or report. They were there when the Dawsons arrived in the 1840s. They were there during the Civil War. They were there in October 1979. They're there still, surrounding the property that generations have called home. The sinkhole remains too, on a remote corner of the property, covered now with vegetation that has accumulated over decades. 14 bodies rest there, in whatever condition the geological processes have left them, their bones perhaps mingling with the limestone that slowly dissolves around them. No one has ever looked there. No one outside the family knows it exists. The case remains officially open. The file sits in GBI storage somewhere, occasionally reviewed when cold case units look for opportunities to close old investigations. Nothing ever comes of these reviews. The witnesses who might have provided evidence are dead or silent. The physical evidence has long since dissolved into the Georgia landscape. The hunting community remembers in its way. The old-timers, fewer every year, as the generation that knew the participants dies off, tell stories about what happened in 1979. They speak of the Dawsons with a particular tone, a mixture of respect and fear that has survived nearly half a century. They know that something happened, even if they don't know exactly what. They know that the McKinnon organization disappeared, that the Dawsons were somehow involved, that the lesson taught in October 1979 has never been forgotten. You don't steal from the Dawsons. You don't take what's theirs. You don't mistake their quiet for weakness or their patience for passivity. In 45 years, no one has ever again attempted to steal from the Dawson family. The lesson was learned, the message was received. The breeding program continues, run now by descendants who carry the knowledge and the silence that their ancestors carried. They produce Redbone Coonhounds that are still exceptional, still sought after, still carrying the genetics that Ezekiel began developing a century ago. When these dogs hunt, when their baying carries through the Georgia night, they carry a legacy that includes more than their bloodlines. They carry the proof that the Dawsons protect what's theirs, whatever the cost. The property remains in family hands, 340 acres of pine and hardwood that 5 generations have worked and maintained. The main house still stands, showing its age now, needing repairs that come slowly when resources are limited. The kennels are updated, modernized for the needs of contemporary breeding, but they occupy the same location they've always occupied, behind the house where Hollis sat on October 9th and watched a stranger ask too many questions. The family gathers for holidays and hunting season. Different faces now, but the same traditions. They sit on the porch where the decision was made, looking out at the property that their ancestors built and their grandfathers defended. They don't talk about October 1979 in any direct way, but the knowledge is there, beneath the surface, shaping how they understand themselves and their place in the world. Some secrets are passed down because they must be. Some knowledge is transmitted not because anyone wants to carry it, but because carrying it is the price of belonging to a family that has done what this family has done. The Dawsons carry it. They will carry it as long as the family exists. And the Georgia pines will keep their silence, as they have kept it for 45 years and will keep it for however many more the future holds. There is a spot on the Dawson property, deep in the back section where the roads don't go, where a man can stand and see nothing but trees in every direction. The pines rise perhaps 80 feet, their trunks straight and rough, their branches beginning high above the ground. The understory is sparse, cleared by periodic burning, the way it's been managed for generations. The ground is covered with pine straw, brown and soft, muffling footsteps, absorbing sound. If you stand in this spot, if you know where it is, which almost no one does, you can look down and see the slight depression in the ground that marks the sinkhole's location. It's not obvious, just a subtle dip in the terrain, covered with vegetation like everything else. You wouldn't notice it unless you were looking for it, unless you knew what was there. 14 men rest in that spot, or what remains of them after 45 years of geological process. They were placed there in October 1979, one by one, the evidence of what the Dawson family did in response to a stolen dog. They were criminals, thieves, men who had built their lives on taking from others. They were also sons and brothers and fathers, men who had people who loved them, who wondered what happened, who never received answers. The earth doesn't judge. The limestone doesn't distinguish between the bones of the righteous and the bones of the wicked. The water that flows through the underground rivers carries everything with equal indifference, moving it slowly toward the coast, toward the vastness of the ocean, where all distinctions dissolve. What remains is the story, the memory, the lesson. Eugene Dawson, 77 years old, the last living participant in the events of 1979, sometimes walks to this spot when he visits the family property. He stands there for a few minutes, looking at nothing in particular, thinking thoughts that he shares with no one. Then he walks back, returns to his life, continues the silence that has defined his existence for 45 years. He never speaks about what happened. When asked by journalists, by researchers, by family members who are curious about the history they have inherited, he changes the subject, offers nothing, maintains the discipline that has protected the family for nearly half a century. But sometimes, in the quiet of his house in McRae, he thinks about it, about the choices that were made, the actions that were taken, the lives that were ended, about whether it was right or wrong or something beyond those categories, about what he would do if he had it to do over again. He never reaches a conclusion. Perhaps there is no conclusion to reach. Perhaps some questions don't have answers, just different ways of living with uncertainty. What he knows, with the certainty that age and experience provide, is that the world is not simple, that morality is not always clear, that men are sometimes faced with choices that offer no good options, only different kinds of bad ones, that the law cannot always protect what matters, and that those who rely entirely on the law to protect them may find themselves unprotected when it matters most. He knows that his family did something terrible. 14 men are dead because of choices made on a porch in October 1979. 14 families lost sons and brothers and fathers. 14 lives ended, violently and irrevocably. He knows that his family also protected something worth protecting. The dog was saved. The operation continued. The legacy that 5 generations had built was preserved for future generations. The message sent in October 1979 ensured that no one would ever try something similar again. Were the 14 lives worth Copper's life? Worth the continuation of the Dawson breeding program? Worth the principle that some things cannot be taken without consequence? Eugene doesn't know. He has spent 45 years not knowing, and he will die not knowing. But he knows what his family decided when the decision had to be made. He knows what they did. He knows what he did. And he carries it, the way his brothers carried it, the way his father carried it, the way everyone who participates in such things must carry them to the end of their days. The Georgia pines stand witness. They have stood witness for a century and a half, since the first Dawsons arrived in this place. They will stand witness for centuries more, as the family continues or ends, as the property is maintained or sold, as the memory of October 1979 fades into history or legend or simple forgetting. They don't judge. They don't remember in any human sense. They simply exist, growing slowly, adding rings, marking the passage of time that reduces everything to its essential elements. 14 men rest beneath them, in a sinkhole that will never be discovered. A dog's bloodline continues, carried by descendants who hunt these woods as their ancestors hunted them. A family keeps its silence, generation after generation, carrying knowledge that can never be shared. And the story continues, not because anyone tells it, but because stories like this don't end. They become part of the landscape, part of the culture, part of the understanding that shapes how communities function and how people behave within them. You don't steal from the Dawsons. Everyone in Telfair County knows that, even if they don't know why, even if they've never heard the specific story, even if they couldn't explain, if asked, what exactly they're afraid of. They know. At some level, they know. And that knowledge protects the family, protects the property, protects everything that 5 generations have built. That's the legacy of October 1979. Not just the deaths, not just the silence, but the understanding that some people will protect what's theirs no matter what the cost. That some families have lines that cannot be crossed. That some things are worth killing for. Whether that's a legacy to be proud of or ashamed of depends on who you are and what you value. The Dawsons have made their peace with it, whatever that peace looks like. The pines keep growing, the dogs keep hunting, the silence holds. And somewhere in the Georgia earth, 14 men keep their secrets forever. If this story made you think about what you would do to protect what's yours, about the bonds that exist between people and their animals and their land, about the justice that systems sometimes fail to provide, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not because it's entertainment, because it's a mirror. What would you do if someone took what mattered most to you? How far would you go to get it back? The Dawsons answered that question in 1979. 45 years later, the answer still echoes through the Georgia pines. Listen carefully. You can almost hear it.